up lots of more questions. So the question what's going on is phrased and placed and historicized and compared. And the answer is much less clear to me. That's the one thing. And the answer is, that's the first thing. I was wondering, how does this type of question imply a certain type of answer? The second is, Williamson invokes a lot of interdisciplinarity, but you reference that, and it would be fascinating to me to see what is the actual interdisciplinary knowledge that goes into there. So that the phrasing of some of the questions sounds like being influenced by pragmatism. If I take Sharon's three elements, right, the first is what's going on, it also seems to possibly reference or not something in history like Leopold Ranke's to tell history as it actually was. The thick description that Sharon puts in is specific anthropology gears. And the third is self-critical, is something that sometimes emerges in anthropology. But of course it's all on a very kind of basic level. Right? And so the second question would be then, where is the interdisciplinarity? And the third, coming from the interdisciplinarity in this central concern that we have, that we phrase for this, and that you take up very nicely between kind of abstract modeling on the one hand and closely cut analysis. I mean, that was not phrased as one is better than the other, but rather indeed as a context tension. I think one of the interesting things in those, so if the criticism in economics is to say the modeling drives us away from the actual real world, then we find in some of the other disciplines the opposite direction, to say, in anthropology, for example, we have no access to the real world. So everything we do with the real world already comes with the construction of models through which we emerge. So in a sense, they go the other way from there. And that's kind of the third relation or reference that would be lovely in the paper. I'm not sure all of that can be done in the paper, but those are things, those are questions that the paper, that is not yet the paper you said, raised for me.
And just the last question is basically not just thinking about the role that models played in economics, but the role models played in other fields as well.
So the way in which this is a reaction to an perceivedly exaggerated abstraction and modeling, and an attempt to get back to reality, right? Whereas some other disciplines, and around the same time, say that reality is much more complex and we have no access to it. And so we build all kinds of epistemological frameworks necessarily, and you can call those models sometimes, in order to have access to what we then call reality. So in that sense, a counter movement may be something that comes at the tables of Carnegie Mellon. I don't know that, but so that would place that within contemporary discussions at the same time in other disciplines.
That's really interesting. I mean, you're absolutely right that the focus of the paper, the grid has a focus, talks about the beginning of the research enterprise, asking a question, and you know, that's interesting, but it would be a lot more interesting also if it had any kind of indication that the product of the research endeavor was also shaped by the question, and not just the original. The beginning of the enterprise, but also the product that its contribution. I think that's a really valuable point. The third point I think is really interesting also. It might be beyond my skill set, but it'd be really interesting. I mean, maybe it wouldn't be. I mean, if I find other writings for conferences like this, where different disciplines really focus on methodology, that might be a very easy way to try to get a sense of what those fields are struggling with. The second question is really interesting also, and I have an answer for it. I don't know if I should go into detail now, but and actually it's interesting. I mean, maybe answering the second question is one way of answering the first question, because Williamson does ask the question, what's going on out there, and then does not just use thick description and different methodologies and a certain degree of self-criticism in offering some answers, But he does actually come up with a theory that incorporates in with it different social sciences, some kind of direction to reality. And it's interesting, in that sense, actually, developing that answer might be a compliment to David's paper, because transaction cost economics or new institutional economics is a way of saying, look, we're not going to look at price as the real variable of interest. We're going to look at organizational form. And yes, we don't entirely know, we can't entirely measure transaction costs as a metric, but we're going to come up with some kind of model that relies on behavioral assumptions that are not just hyper-rational. And we're going to try to figure out how individuals and assets organize themselves, and see if we can have some kind of, albeit crude, theory to describe what's going on. So I guess I'm thinking out loud. I can imagine answering your second question. All right, so how did Williamson answer his question himself as a way of maybe answering the first question? That's neat.
Super. Katerina.
Yeah, I think the first question that just came to my mind when I was reading the paper is, how it fits to David's, and so I think I'll leave that mostly to him. But I just wanted to point out that he did get his Nobel Prize for transaction cost economics, which to me at least doesn't seem like an answer to the question of what's going on out there. Where do you look and what are you looking at? It's what you just described is kind of it's more contextualized than the neoclassical economics, but for a lawyer in particular, it is still at a level where it just lines out a lot of stuff, especially when we talk about organizations, right? None of the theories of the firm get close to explaining a corporation. Also, Jensen Macklin didn't get close to explaining a corporation as a legal entity with legal personality and all the stuff that gets to it. So the question is always when you say, what's going on out there is, what is it that actually is of interest, and then what do we do with this? So we're looking at certain features that are accessible to us, but how interdisciplinary this is widespread, or we can push it a little further, raises some questions. And what you do with this, in the end, you want to go back to a kind of modeling exercise that gives you the respect amongst the economic profession. So I was a bit ambivalent about the because I didn't know him. I don't have any personal relations to him, but I was just wondering whether it's a bit of a romanticization of like a meta-level interim theory, but it's somewhat caught in between. So the discipline of economics on the one hand, and a realization perhaps internally that it doesn't deliver fully, but also an unwillingness or incapability of getting completely out of it.
That's
just
wonderful.
being cute on the second order.
Maybe. I mean, it's wonderful. And for sure, this is a hagiography. It's not, it's a little embarrassing. And maybe I was feeling a little emotional when I was writing it. I should pull that back for sure. It's fascinating. There is definitely a lot of truth to the statement. Transaction cost economics was fairly useful, but not really a success story. Now, I'm a little resistant to that because I think there's a really neat empirical literature that looks at all sorts of organizational forms where TCE-motivated hypotheses have some really valuable empirical evidence behind it. But for sure, they don't, TCE theory, the question of vertical integration doesn't answer the really big questions about how the modern corporation operates, why it's structured the way it is. There's a real, TCE might do a pretty good job of explaining things in a static sense, but not really in a dynamic sense. The really interesting organizations, like the Fed, for example, I mean, maybe you can use TCE to explain its framework, but it's pretty, you gotta push pretty hard to get anything out of it. And that's actually one thing why I think we're talking about David's paper. I said, Williamson said, look, there's a lot we still don't know, and maybe it's a story about the cup being half full. Maybe it's also a story. Now, if I'm really being defensive, it's there's a fair amount of empirical success and a lot of success in encouraging people to ask questions exactly like you asked, that we don't know the answer to. But I think your point about how it not only maybe nudged the ball in one direction, only a little bit, but never really broke out, never really changed the corpus of economics is a very useful point. And you know, I mean, you know, maybe it really is that, you know, Coase and Williamson were just critics of the field, but couldn't really move the tanker in any meaningful way. I don't know if I'm going to take a dour perspective on the paper, but I certainly should be less reverential.
So I have David, myself, Roy, Yaniv. David.
As someone who's reverential about his advisor, even when he disagrees with them, I go with it. I mean, you know, like the Guru Shesha relationship is a sacred relationship, so I get that. You know, speaking of, yeah. So I had a different thought, which is sort of responsive to all this stuff, and it might generate thoughts for where to take this paper. Because I was thinking, so when you say what's going on here, if you're not asking the students, I take it this was the real, what was so valuable about Williamson. When you say what's going on here, he's not sort of saying, here's your toolkit, go and apply it to a reality that you don't have your percussion bed, right? But when he says what's going on there, nevertheless there has to be something then that's guiding attention. And if it's not a bunch of very abstract concepts that he was resistant to, if you could say more about how he guides attention, that might be responsive to partly to what Katerina is saying and to what Ralph was saying about what counts as an answer. And that may be an optimistic way of doing it, because it could be that many of the students didn't get that aspect of the question, and instead they took some of the partial answers that had been generated to what's going on here and reified them as new models and concepts, and then went out and started to try and make reality fit those. And so I was thinking about this in relation to the concepts context idea, because you put one set of concepts aside, and it's better to understand context, but you can't just examine context because reality is too much. So then you need to have a different, if not concept, you need an orientation or a frame or something that's motivating why you pick up on certain things rather than other things. And then as soon as you do that successfully in one context, there's going to be a huge temptation to pull that up as a free-floating concept and port it to the next context. It's going to be the kind of thing grad students are going to do. Oh, well, if there was a principal agent problem in this industry, well, I'm sure there has to be one here too, right? I got to get this thing done in 3 years, and then you've got another person to do it. But it might not be what was going on there in a way. So I wonder if you could reflect on that in your place. I think the question is right, but if you're not then sort of relying on concepts, you're allowing context to speak to you, you're nevertheless pre-selecting some things, and then you set up a legacy, and then students have to either reject the legacy to think anew every time, which is hard to do in
a competitive job market.
Exactly. And there's path dependence of concepts. So I think that's really nice. If you could talk about some of that. And I was thinking about someone, if you wanted a comparison point, is Douglas North, who interests me a lot, because North was on this Williamson path to like kind of more and more and more stuff. And then at some point, it's like he went so far beyond the frame that Kevin talked, that like, I think at some point the economists disavowed him as an economist, or he started self-identifying as like a sociologist or something, right? And so I was also interested in the disciplinary line, because there's you can do some conceptual moves, and then there's this kind of invisible line where if you go too far in bringing context in, you end up with a different set of concepts, and then you find yourself in a different discipline. It's like, oops, I drove too far and I'm in a different zip code or something. And that thing, I suspect that a lot of Williamson students faced that. Do they, especially when they end up in business schools, law schools, are they organization scientists, are they economists? Something about disciplinary self-identification with concepts, I think would be super interesting in this period. And your first-hand knowledge of Williamson would like bring that out if you could trace some of that.
Just as an empirical question, it'd be really interesting to look at all of the students and see where they are right
how
now.
do they identify and why? Like what concepts are they using? You know, do some of them not go too far in the behavioral economics direction? They find themselves calling themselves social psychologists or something. I don't know, but that would be like, how does interdisciplinarity turn into new forms of disciplinarity.
Yeah. I mean, so I guess you made 3 points. The second and the third are a little bit in tension with one another, in a good way. On one hand, you can imagine Williamson students, populating all sorts of departments.
Right.
On the other hand, and I think this is probably a little closer to reality, so the first half of my answer will be critical, the second will be, I'll go back to being, to the hagiography. I actually think it's very safe to say, and I hadn't thought about this as a reflection of either the market or the field, or maybe him and us. But I actually think it's safe to say that a majority of the students did exactly what you described, which is, Williamson's a genius, he's got all this stuff, but I need a job. Let me find a particular industry where there's a really simple make or buy question. I'll do a binomial variable, and there we go. And I think that's the path of least resistance, and I think it was the path that most took, which is a very interesting thing. And maybe, if I'll be a little defensive about it, maybe one only has the luxury of talking about methodology when one has tenure and is invited to a conference like this. But I think it's very, very telling. It's a really, really interesting point you just made. So now I'll go back to shamelessly praising him. 2 other of his mantras were, he used the word toolkit, which is great. He said that, TCE is not your toolkit. It's going to be one of the arrows in your quiver. So he was always very, at least in terms of what he said, maybe not what he encourages graduate students to do, what he said, this is one of many tools to understand what the world's like. I think he was really enthusiastic about economics being one of many social sciences, and maybe the Nobel Prize in economics really would become a Nobel Prize in social sciences. I think he got it with Eleanor Ostrom, who is not an economist, political scientist, and that was only good news for him. That's where he wanted the field to go. And the other really interesting thing is one of his other mantras is it feeds into, I think, the way he encourages research to be done, is that you don't always just want to look at the typical instance. You don't want to put your hand in the pile of jelly beans and pick the mean. That tends to be what predictive science is. You want to figure out what the mean is. So you actually sometimes learn a lot more with what he calls the extreme instance. And that actually for sure is the diamond industry. It's a very weird thing. And instead of trying to embrace it as something that's sui generis, maybe it's something that, because of its unusualness, because of its extreme qualities, can actually offer insights into the essence of the way the rest of the world works. And one hand, you got a lot of people just doing binomial variables. Is it make? Is it buy? Maybe there's a third variable, which is it's a hybrid. But I think he also really thought that if you looked at, the reason you want to look at what's going on out there is because you'll find things that don't make sense. And you find things that don't make sense, then maybe you'll get some really cool insight into broader things too.
Okay, so now I'm nervous about reverence, unlike David. So I was much more on the Katerina side, and kind of the meta point was what are the pitfalls of minor self-critique? And I saw 2 pitfalls here. Minor self-critique. One pitfall is that it seems to me that both from what I read in you, but also more generally what I see in the kind of seemingly, I want to say, open-minded economics and law in economics is being, including some of what Sharon said, is being very open to get data from other disciplines or look at other disciplines as data. Which means that on almost every law, every and economics thing that I know, X and economics or economics and something, is basically doing economics with another discipline as a source of information, rather than taking that other discipline seriously. I'm not sure that this is correct with respect to all the disciplines, I'll put a lot of money to say that this is law and economics. Law and economics does not take seriously anything theoretical about law. And period. I want to put it as bluntly. I mean, we are almost at 4 o'clock. I want to be provocative, right? So it seems to me that, that's not really what's going on out here, in a sense that I keep on the same glasses. I just want others to be my spies in order to bring stuff to me. But I'm still the chief. So it's pretty convenient. One point. The other point is that the openness, at least here, and that's not correct with respect to law and economics or economics more generally, but here, the openness is only regarding empirical stuff, and there is no mention even of any openness to any normative judgment, as if we can really understand the is, and I was trying to hold on to this point throughout the 2 days, and I'll talk about it a little bit in my 10 minutes at the concluding, so this is just a preview, as if we can actually understand the is without saying anything about the art. So, and some people talked about the kind of a normative, a hidden or a normative agenda, and it's like we can't understand the is without the art. And the one point in which it made me really furious was at page 9. You didn't put page numbers, but I did. Page 9. When Paul Josko, who was one of the people that you signed, is becoming just apologetic about, antitrust helping the biggies. And that's just because we don't do normative stuff. We just look at it as. So these are 2 different points, right? The first point is it really openness to anything? Because it's just data. It's not taking, and that sort of plays with I think David's point about what happens when you actually take seriously another discipline. Then you're ostracized. Because you talk a different language. We don't want that language, we want the data. And the other is the normative stuff. And yeah.
Well, so maybe
I didn't speak throughout the day. It's difficult for me. Otherwise my shrink would have.
Well, yeah. I mean, I'll leave the normative stuff for afterwards. In large part, I think the normative stuff is very fraught, and I don't think there was a single paper where there was some kind of tension as to what the normative framework should be, which is only good. So I'll just say, yeah, it's fraught, and we'll talk about it. You can talk about it at the end. I might be a little bit more sanguine about interdisciplinarity. I mean, I do think that economics rightfully has been accused of being a little imperialist. A little. And I think law and economics either has been already conquered or now is imperialism on steroids. But it's funny. I guess part of this came out in Williamson's description of what Jim March was trying to do, or Dick Sire, one of the two. Talking across disciplines is hard. I think this. The last 2 days have illustrated a little bit of that, but I'm pretty sanguine as to how productive it can be. And it doesn't necessarily require economics, say, to entirely adopt the assumptions underlying anthropology, but there's something synthetic about the engagement.
And I agree with you. I just saying that as I'm not descriptive about the kind of what economics and law and economics and those people are doing. They're not. I agree that it can be great. It's just that that's not what they're doing.
I think some of them are doing it. I guess that's what I'm saying.
So that can be productive. So I think you should put it in to show that they're doing.
Yeah.
That's kind of follow up on Ralph.
That's a very good point. Yeah. I guess you're talking about being a little more specific about not just talking on interdisciplinarity, but how genuinely interdisciplinary conversations.
And be self-critical about the idea of being interdisciplinarity. What do they take from the others? Do they only take the legal data, like Sharon said. I mean, now that we know that this is what that contract do, we economists can analyze it with our own tools. So that is a wonderful example of taking law as just data, not as...
So I shouldn't just be saying one, I have to prove what I'm saying.
So
That's kind of annoying.
So Ron is three fingers, that's more than what I have. So you should talk and then Roy and then...
I use this one later if there will be time. Just follow up.
There won't be time. So maybe you should take Ron and Roy and Yaniv and then you...
No, so I'll be last then.
Okay, so Roy, Yaniv and Ron.
Okay, so there's something about speaking about a methodology that is sort of the way to talk about it, one of the main things is bringing in more context, but then you talk about methodology so abstractly that we can ostensibly get it in this phrase that isn't necessarily a very specific phrase. So just what's going on here is, it's not like there's a special providence in the fall of a sparrow, right, where it couldn't have been reproduced independently, or it couldn't mean in comparison to what, which is what some other economists say when I think they mean almost the same thing. And so I think one of the ways to get some purchase out of the phrase is not by looking for how many times it was used, but for looking at, and it also doesn't matter that, I don't know, out of 50 or 100 students, I don't know how many students he had, that 80 did the thing that wasn't that innovative. But if there are one or two pieces that make, nobody's going to turn out, no brilliant person is going to turn out, every paper perfect, and certainly not every student perfect. So the question is, if there's something indicative that could use as an example that would say something that's special came out of this, and here's what it turns on. That wouldn't require, I think, turning into a sociologist of knowledge or something like that, but to pull out, why you find this so special. I get the sense that it definitely drives you, and we get the sense of that, but less of why, because there isn't an example to show the benefit.
Yaniv.
I'm going to ask a question that might reiterate or rephrase several questions, but I'll try to take a stab at my own phrasing of it. And I'm also going to try to take a stab at interpreting Williamson with all reverence, but you said it's a half hagiography, so please entertain this exegetic exercise.
I have to delete that happen.
You seem to kind of like draw attention here on the axis between modeling as a methodological approach and other social scientific approaches that are more thick description and context bringing. A different way to think about this phrase of what's going on here, I think, and I suggest that this is, I think, what Williamson meant also by reading what you wrote about his contemporaries, is to base not a different methodological approach, but a different epistemic approach. That is to base the modeling on reality or real world phenomena that are observed, rather than, and then asking rather than what is actually bringing us to the normative kind of like question of what is economics, and is it like its own kind of like performative making, laws of nature device. But I think that Williamson's warning is to bring the models back down on the context of what was going on in his days to real markets, real economic phenomena like corporations, etc. So again, it's a different interpretation of the same thing, but I think it goes in line with your own intention.
The last person to speak in this conference before the concluding remarks is Ron.
last person to speak in this conference will be you, but for now,
No, it will be
You just have that feeling.
so one observation with respect to the conversation between Barak and Sharon, and one with respect to Hanoch's comment. So one way of thinking about, I mean, there is, I think, a distinction between, let's say, a theoretically based model and a theorem, and just what's going on here. These are three different exercises, I think, in a sense. So in a theoretical model, you take assumptions, and the assumptions are implicitly take those things that are being assumed as non-central for the exercise. Some of them might be a bit more important, and then you might want to relax them later on, but they're less central for the exercise. And they're at least explicit, and that's what economists always say to other disciplines. We're explicit about assumptions, whereas you're not explicit. And whereas the theorem, like the Modigliani Miller or the cause theorem, is a definition of circumstances that do not exist in real life. So you are using them against reality in order to better understand reality, not in order to apply them and explain by them reality. Let's say the Modigliani and Miller assumptions clearly do not understand with cause. And I think that the exercise that was suggested, which is central to Williamson and I think also to North, is to try and explain some puzzle within reality. And then the theoretical models are being driven from elsewhere in a pragmatic way to be applied to this puzzle. I'm not sure how useful is this, but it might be useful to some extent.
Yeah, no, that is right.
And then there is this point for Hanoch, so I don't know when.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead, yeah.
So I think that you're mixing two types of, maybe one could call it imperialism in economics. Let's say if you compare a public choice to behavioral economics, they are doing totally different exercises. So public choice applies price theory to non-market contexts, to political contexts, etc. Whereas behavioral borrows insights from another discipline, from psychology, but selectively and through the filters of the discipline of economics, so that they'll be useful in economic exercises. So these are not just borrowing data. Each of them is doing something else than borrowing data.
I like that answer.
That's good. I don't need to have the last answer. It's your panel, Barak. You'll say the last word.
I mean, Ron, I think that's right. I think that I guess both that you've illustrated some of what makes me excited, and I think some of what made Williamson excited about conversations across disciplines. I also think you're right about the different ways that being tied to a model can lead to problematic research, and why what prompted the charge to get us out of models. So I mean, can my last word just be that sounds really good to me?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, all that sounds really good to me.